Well, I'm delighted that so many people showed up tonight and just showed interest in science and art. It gives me hope for the future. I'm actually I'm a new member of the Science and Art Club of Germantown. And I have to say, I'm really impressed with how warm your embrace is. Every member that I've been meeting so far has been so welcoming. But I'm also impressed with your conceptual embrace. You're not just a science club, you're not just an art club, you're a science and art club. And I think for that reason, you're able to embrace a lot of different perspectives. And frankly, I think you could just have aptly called yourself the Democrat and Republican Club of Germantown. Anyway, I'm not the first by far to observe the differences between the arts and the sciences. British scientist Charles Percy Snow, for example, he spent his working days, of course, amongst his colleagues, scientists, but at night he caroused with his literary friends. And he once said about that life, "I felt I was moving among two groups, comparable in intelligence, not grossly different in social origin, earning about the same incomes, who had almost ceased to communicate at all." Now, Snow wrote those words in his 1959 book, Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution in 1959. And yet now we still bring those two disparate perspectives together and expect them to exist. Institutions of higher learning bring together the sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, and the arts or the humanities, philosophy, history, literature, and they expect them all to cooperate in one roof, under one roof. And that's the case of my former employer, Drexel University. They brought together those disciplines and many more into the College of Arts and Sciences. And as undergraduates of Drexel University or whatever university you graduated from, you know the content of these courses is radically different. But what are the real differences between biology, let's say, and literature? I think that question articulates nicely with Denise Wash's talk last month, which she so provocatively entitled, "Jeff Koons, Artist or Art Con Man?" So let's consider science first. How does biology or any of the life sciences know the world? Well, let's enlist the help of a real scientist to help us answer that question. This is Barry Marshall, who back in the 1980s began to notice that gastric ulcers were not caused by too much spicy food or too much psychological stress. He found that his patients suffered from gastric ulcers because they had an infection in their guts. This would be bad news for Big Pharma at the time because SmithKline French, for instance, was making about $1 billion a year on Tagamet. So radical was Marshall's discovery that it took him years to convince his colleagues and Big Pharma that he was right about ulcer disease. But eventually he did, and he ended up winning the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2005.
You know about him, Barry Marshall?
And in his Nobel
Prize in Medicine.
In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he actually articulates the ways that science knows the world. And so at one point in his speech, he reviews the past research in gastric ulcers, which is a typical thing that researchers will do as they approach their topic. And he says, Marshall says, Magnus could not explain why gastritis would be so strongly linked with the ulcer in the duodenum rather than the stomach. So the word explain here, it seems to me, identifies one of the fundamental goals of science, which is to explain worldly phenomena. Marshall described the challenges that the disease presents to physicians when he said, ulcer disease lasts many years with an unpredictable tendency towards healing and recurrence. The word unpredictable here, I think, identifies what most scientists hope for, and that is to successfully predict the behavior of nature. After he recounted his success with gastric ulcers, Marshall suggested that science might extend his discovery into other areas. He said, Helicobacter pylori, the bacterium in question, may play a role in other poorly understood gastric diseases, such as peptic ulcer and gastric cancer. So I think his impulse here to make related guesses is central to all scientists' efforts to test hypotheses. And once he confidently diagnosed the relationship between the pathogen and the disease, Marshall advanced to treatment. And he said, I had treated several patients with bismuth and metronidazole with a 100% cure rate for my first 4 cases. It's a start. So I think that for physicians, treatment represents the pinnacle of their success as scientists, which is to control the phenomenon that they're studying. At the end of the speech, Marshall addressed the resistance to his pathogen theory of ulcer disease. He said, I realized then that the medical understanding of ulcer disease was akin to a religion. No amount of logical reasoning could budge what people knew in their hearts to be true. I think that by characterizing his obstinate colleagues as people who reasoned with their hearts was a way for Marshall to identify a violation of a core value of science, objectivity. So here are what I think are the ways that scientists look at the world. They seek to explain data or phenomena. They want to predict future events. They test hypotheses. They control nature. And all along, they try to maintain objectivity. Now, what about the arts? How does literature, let's say, or any of the other so-called humanities know the world? Well, again, let's enlist someone else to help us with that question, a real humanist. You probably recognize James Baldwin, perhaps one of the most influential public intellectuals of the 20th century. He wrote essays, novels, plays, with a keen sense of injustice and inequality in his world. He's especially known for his Cambridge University debate with William F. Buckley Jr. over the question, has the American dream been achieved at the expense of the American Negro? For his participation in that debate, Baldwin received a standing ovation from a very white audience. He once said, "It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive or who had ever been alive." Thus, I think Baldwin here is identifying one of the foremost goals of the arts, which is to understand people, both ourselves and our fellow human beings. Elsewhere, Baldwin said, "How can one respect, let alone adopt, the values of a people who do not, on any level whatever, live the way they say they do, or the way they say they should?" Here, I think Baldwin identifies another goal of the arts, which is to clarify the values by which we should live. Baldwin said about art itself, "All art is a kind of confession, more or less oblique. All artists, if they are to survive, are forced at last to tell the whole story, to vomit up the anguish." So I think that by defining his own art, Baldwin is identifying another goal of the arts, which is to invoke aesthetic appeals. Baldwin said boldly once, "You write in order to change the world. If you alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it." I think Baldwin put himself at risk by admitting that he embraces this goal of changing the world, of reforming society. Throughout his life as an artist, Baldwin exposed to the world his own heart, as he did when he said, "If I am not what you say I am, then you are not who you think you are." I think that so must all artists wear their hearts on their sleeves if they are to take seriously the goal of the arts, which is to embrace subjectivity. So here are what I think are the goals, or the ways rather, that artists look at the world. They want to understand people, clarify values, invoke aesthetic appeals, reform society, and all the while embrace their subjectivity. So to see these differences between the arts and the sciences, I would like to show you them all at once on one screen. And when you see them this way, side by side, they might seem almost irreconcilable. And yet, I think that the wording of these goals somehow seems parallel and maybe even complementary. In any event, I propose that we might relate these two disparate sets of goals with one word: rhetoric. Now, I know what you're thinking. Lawrence, have you lost your mind? How can you sully a conversation about the arts and the sciences with that word? Don't you know how evil rhetoric is? The newspaper headlines this year alone point to the rhetoric's awful reputation. Here's one from the Washington Post. "Ominous rhetoric gains ground in Russia as its forces founder in the Ukraine." Here's one from the Wall Street Journal. "Trump's death wish rhetoric." And this one from the New York Times. I'm not going to recite this one because despite all of my rehearsals, I always sound like Elmer Fudd. "White-wing rhetoric." Now, I understand that you have some discomfort over this word because it appears on my diploma. So here's the document that certifies my PhD in rhetoric. I mean, you can imagine why I hesitate to tell my friends. I mean, I'm really coming out here. You can imagine why I hesitate telling my friends that I have a PhD in rhetoric.
Never heard of that.
Easy, I think, to think, as my friends do, that rhetoric is just bullshit. But it actually has a venerable past, and I think it can be quite useful to us in the present, apart from how it's used in politics. So in this part of my talk, I hope I can persuade you that rhetoric is one of the legitimate arts, and that it can be useful, especially when it comes in contact with the sciences. Rhetoric is actually one of the three classical liberal arts. It has its roots in ancient Greece, where it was an essential tool for the democracy and the democratic institutions in Greece. Now you might recognize this bust of Aristotle, who collected the principles of rhetoric at the time in 4th century BC in a work called The Rhetoric. It actually was his lecture notes for his students. And it contained, I think, a rather neutrally expressed definition of the R word. It said, rhetoric may be defined as the faculty for observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. That sounds benign enough, right? I mean, what's the moral harm in a little rhetoric? Actually, Aristotle cared pretty deeply about the ethical practice in rhetoric, as it's implied by these three concepts that he came up with that are the means for rhetoric that he referred to in the definition. The three means of persuasion are logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos is Aristotle's way of referring to the speaker's choice of words that he utters to the audience. Ethos is the speaker's credibility in the eyes of the audience. And pathos is the speaker's understanding of the audience's beliefs, attitudes, and values. So, to be persuasive, speakers must attend to their relationship with the audience. So by putting things into little boxes like this, Aristotle seemed to actually anticipate the modern scientific method. Thus, for example, he put all of the reasons to speak publicly into three categories, or what we call rhetorical genres: deliberative, forensic, and ceremonial speeches. Deliberative speeches are ones that call for action in the future. Forensic speeches defend acts in the past. And ceremonial speeches praise customs and people and places in the present. So let me illustrate those three rhetorical genres with the words of three Hollywood artists. When Meryl Streep speaks as Emmeline Pankhurst in the movie Suffragette, she is delivering a deliberative speech when she says, "We are fighting for a time in which every little girl born into the world will have an equal chance with her brothers." When Denzel Washington speaks as a plaintiff attorney in the movie Philadelphia, he is delivering a forensic speech when he says, "Our fear of homosexuals and that climate of hatred and fear translated into the firing of this particular homosexual, my client, Andrew Beckett." And when Marlon Brando, a young Marlon Brando, speaks as Mark Antony in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, he is delivering a ceremonial speech. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." Notice the power here of the genre of each of these speeches. We come to expect a certain content, form, and style. We get an appetite for certain kinds of words, even after hearing just the first few words of these speeches. Now, we don't always get what we expect, as is in the case of Brando, because Brando's speech is full of irony, but we'll talk about irony later. 2 centuries after Aristotle's death, the Romans conquered Greece, and they appropriated much of its culture, including rhetoric. So rhetoric became an important tool for the Roman Republic. And even the Romans, well, a few of them anyway, were concerned about the ethical use of rhetoric. One of them was Marcus Tullius Cicero, the greatest orator of his time, and perhaps of any time. He once said about rhetoric, "The greater this power is, the more necessary it is to join it to integrity and the highest measure of good sense. For if we put the full resources of speech at the disposal of those who lack these virtues, we will certainly not make of them orators, but we will put weapons into the hands of madmen." Cicero's words were very prescient for his time, and they're eerily prescient for our own. So powerful, in fact, was Cicero's use of rhetoric that his political enemies cut off his head and hands and put them on public display in the Roman Forum, as if to say, look, now the eloquence of his voice and his hands can no longer persuade us. Here is Francois Perrier's rendering of the assassination of Cicero. It actually coincided with the end of the Roman Republic, the death of democracy, and the disappearance of rhetoric as a political tool. Now, rhetoric did survive, but only as an ornament for ceremonies and sermons. Sorry about that, David. But it was no longer used as a political tool until the return of democracy about 1,000 years later. But with the return of democracy into the modern era, rhetoric took on another function. Besides a tool for persuasion, it became a means of criticism. So that now the academy, like Drexel, like University of Pennsylvania, yes, they still teach rhetoric as a way of training public speakers, but they also use it to train critics of public discourse, even the discourse among scientists, what is now formally called the rhetoric of science. My first introduction to the rhetoric of science as a graduate student at Temple was Stephen B. Katz's 1992 paper entitled "The Ethic of Expediency, Classical Rhetoric, Technology, and the Holocaust." Katz, in this article, by the way, he's a technical writing instructor, but in this article, he analyzes a German memo that attempts to persuade a superior officer of the necessity for technical improvements to vans that were used in the early Nazi program for exterminating what they termed the undesirables. Katz, in fact, evaluated this memo as a perfect example of technical writing, perhaps too perfect. It sets up a problem to be solved. It offers a solution by advancing cause and effect arguments. But apart from its hideous purpose, Katz identified ethical problems of this bit of technical writing at a more granular level. In fact, he found words used to objectify and conceal the process of exterminating human beings. Jewish women and children become the load, pieces of and merchandise, and their bodies' waste products become fluid and large pieces of dirt. Katz's point here was that the ethic of expediency underlies this memo, and in fact, all technical writing. Furthermore, he says that the ethic was at least partially responsible for the Holocaust. So let me offer a few bits of my own research in the rhetoric of science. Ever since Aristotle posited the three types of speech, deliberative, forensic, and ceremonial, rhetoric in general has trafficked in categories. And now the rhetoric of science has found others, like the apology for misconduct. What do you want to hear when you listen to an apology, especially one directed to yourself? Aristotle would understand that question as an expression of concern for the audience's values and attitudes, what he called pathos. Most of us, I think, would like to hear what a contemporary philosopher once called a consummate apologizer. It's strange in that we need a professional philosopher to tell us how to apologize. So what is a consummate apologizer? Well, they admit they have wronged the victim, they feel regret for the wrongdoing, and they resolve to abstain from such wrongdoing in the future. A fairly simple three aspects of a real apology. And with such criteria, we can now judge whether any given apology seems sincere or simply ritualistic. Where do you find apologies among scientists? Well, there are examples to be found in the published errata and retraction notices in research journals. In fact, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors requires such notices. They say, if a fraudulent paper has been published, the journal must print a retraction. So here's a case in point. This is Dr. Kim, professor and chairman of the Department of Biological Sciences in a university in South Korea. And he published this article,
Remember that.
along with colleagues, in the journal Neurochemical Research. But a few weeks later, the editor of the journal detected plagiarism in Dr. Kim's article, and he confronts Dr. Kim with it. And Dr. Kim wrote this letter of apology, which said in part, I inadvertently copied a passage and neglected to paraphrase that passage in my own words and include a proper citation. I know my careless mistake resulted in a severe ethical issue. I am really disappointed in myself as a researcher. However, I feel I must take responsibility for my actions. Today, I will forward exact copies of this letter to the university where I currently hold an academic appointment. There's a certain urgency in this letter, and I try to recreate it by reading it quickly, but we may never really know whether Dr. Kim is truly sincere, but he seems to use the right words in his apology to convey responsibility, remorse, and resolve. In any event, the stakes in Dr. Kim's lapse in honesty seem modest, if not nugatory. But what about this case? This Sean Connery lookalike is Eric Pullman, who between 1992 and 2000 published much research on the metabolic changes that arise from menopause. But in 2005, the editors of Annals of Internal Medicine wrote this editorial, which said in part, in October of 2003, I issued a notice of retraction for an article by Eric Pullman. I was acting on a letter from the provost of the University of Vermont describing the outcome of the university's investigation of allegations of fraudulent conduct of research. This investigation found that Dr. Pullman had published fabricated data in the Annals of Internal Medicine and 2 other journals. Pullman, who at that time had received maybe $2 or $3 million of support from the National Institutes of Health, wrote this response. I wish to acknowledge that the editor of Annals of Internal Medicine appropriately retracted my paper after receiving notification from the University of Vermont that an investigation had determined that I had falsified and fabricated the reported data. In addition, I request that this letter be published to ensure that the scientific community is notified and that I accept full responsibility for this falsification and fabrication. I don't know about you, but this does not seem like a consummate apology to me. I mean, he acknowledges responsibility, but he could have generated a little more goodwill among his readers by showing a little remorse. After all, a well-phrased apology could have been his way of achieving all of the following effects of a consummate apology. That they are, first of all, contrition for the offender, reconciliation for the victim, deterrence for the offender's colleagues, and a public restoration for the offender's colleagues. A public restoration of the faith in the research community. This third one I think is important because his research was funded by taxpayer dollars, and you want to keep the public's goodwill in order for that to continue. Well, these effects, though, arise depending on whether the apology is sincere or simply ritualistic. So scientists should have the humility to apologize publicly for wrongdoing, but they also are expected to show goodwill, particularly towards their colleagues, what Aristotle would have called ethos. But goodwill is not just some abstract idea from 4th century Greece. It turns out to be a very practical contemporary requirement for scientists today. Again, drawing from the resources of the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors, they say that authors and their reviewers must play nice during peer review. Peer review, of course, is the process by which scientists submit their research for publication. Hopefully it gets approved and published. And the medical journal editors say that during this process, editors must take efforts to screen discourteous, inaccurate, or libelous statements and should not allow ad hominem arguments intended to discredit and vilify opinions or findings. Now, Aristotle in the 4th century told us that it's fallacious to attack arguers rather than the arguments. But in 2009, we found out that certain climate scientists ignored Aristotle when more than 1,000 of their emails at the Climate Research Unit of the University of East Anglia were hacked and made public. These scientists were working on the 2007 report of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And some of the emails for these guys betrayed a lack of goodwill. For example, Phil Jones, who was actually the director of the Climate Research Unit, he wrote this comment in an email about a fellow scientist's lack of independence. Hilke wouldn't understand independence if it hit him in the face. As it turns out, Roger Pilkey, the person that he was attacking, an American meteorologist, he had criticized the panel for cherry picking its data, but that sort of behavior, it seems to me, is independence. Harsher still was an email by Michael Mann, who is now professor of Earth and Environmental Science at Penn. He criticized an opponent for being indifferent to honest debate. That opponent was Michael Mann. He said of Michael Mann, the last thing this guy cares about is honest debate. And actually, Stephen McIntyre, he's, at the time, he was an amateur climate researcher, but he knew a thing or two about statistics. And he really did care about honest debate. so much so that he found errors in the temperature readings in the data set for the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. And he advised them about the errors, and the Institute, within days, corrected those figures. So these two attempts to silence dissent among climate scientists through personal attacks, even when voiced privately, they seem mean-spirited. And worse, disdainful of the norm of science that demands open communication for the sake of discovering the truth. In fact, scientists are enjoined by that norm to say what they mean and mean what they say, what Aristotle would have called logos. Most scientists live by that norm, but not all. In 2001, Leonard Libovici, a young physician at the Rabin Medical Center in Israel, published this paper in the British Medical Journal. It was a study about effects of remote retroactive intercessory prayer on outcomes in patients with bloodstream infection. This paper was published actually after there had already been quite a bit of research on whether or not intercessory prayer would have any effect on patients. Then almost 10 years later, the prestigious Cochrane Reviews, which are meta-analyses of research, and they're trying to find trends over several studies rather than just looking at one. They do a meta-analysis on 10 studies of intercessory prayer, which included about 7,600 patients all total. And Roberts reported that all of those studies showed no significant effects from intercessory prayer, except for the study by Libovici. Now, they probably would not have included his paper if they had found Libovici's letter to the editor 3 months after the publication of his paper, in which he said, "This paper has nothing to do with religion. I believe that prayer is a real comfort and help to a believer. I do not believe it should be tested in controlled trials." He was only kidding. He was being ironic. However, not everybody got the joke. In fact, by 2014, his paper had received more than 60 citations. More than 60 other papers had cited Libovici's paper on the effects of retroactive intercessory prayer. Libovici did not mean what he said, but many of his readers took him at his word. The word retroactive in his title should have been a red flag to readers. Why? Because it reflects the fact that Libovici administered the prayer after he collected data. In fact, some of his patients were already dead by the time he collected the data. How could this have happened in the context of science? Might the rhetoric of science help us to answer that question? Rhetoricians, in fact, have discovered that readers, when they are confronted by an ironic message, they often follow a certain sequence of steps to evaluate it and to reconstruct its meaning. And they are, first of all, to reject the literal meaning of the passage, to search for alternative meanings, to consider the writer's intention, and then finally to select one of those meanings consistent with step 3. Now, I read those 60 papers that cited Libovici. I wanted to determine to what extent did they know that this was a bogus study, that it was a spoof, that it was ironic. And to what extent did the readers try to reconstruct that paper if they knew that it was in jest? Here's one reader who did not reject the literal meaning of Libovici's paper. despite the word retroactive in the title. This is Larry Dawsey, medical doctor, and he said about Leibovici's paper, Leibovici's bold experiment suggests that for certain operations of consciousness, earlier and later may have no meaning. Now, I don't want to indulge here in ad hominem attacks, but I suspect that Dr. Dawsey had ulterior motives for taking this paper seriously. He is, after all, the author of books like Healing Words and Prayer is Good Medicine. Here is an author who took Leibovici's paper to be sincere, but rejected its literal meaning. They said, even a randomized study done according to the state-of-the-art methods can lead to spurious and ridiculous results. So he's not criticizing Leibovici so much as suggesting that maybe the method itself is vulnerable. Only a few readers, I found, worried that Leibovici was pulling our legs. One of them was Turner in this paper, and Turner wrote, Leibovici's intent may have been to parody the other prayer studies. So these examples, I think, are cautionary tales for all writers, but especially for scientists on these counts. Number one, writers' successful use of irony depends on the reader's ability to judge the writer's sincerity. Two, if readers miss the writer's irony, they can be seriously misled. And three, if ironic reports like Leibovici's are published, they can propagate errors and corrupt the research archive for future readers. So tonight, I've shown you some unhappy moments when scientists have communicated badly. They are thankfully rare. But I suggest that the insights from the field of rhetoric might help us to discover and, if not correct, these behaviors. You know, I wish that despite his grumpy countenance, that C.P. Snow could have been among you tonight, and that all of you would believe that I have made at least a plausible case for my conclusions. Number one, effective communication, especially in science, depends on a healthy relationship between speaker and audience, between writer and reader. Two, that rhetoric can be a help to facilitate that relationship. And three, the rhetoric of science, in particular, might be a bridge between the sciences and the arts. Science and art are two disparate, but I think complementary perspectives. We need both of them if we are to survive as a species. Science shows us how to explain, predict, and control nature, but the arts give us a means to question whether we should do so. Scientists and artists are not at odds with each other. In fact, they embrace each other's understanding of nature, and they, I think, reinforce each other's mutual appreciation of its mystery. In fact, let me call on an artist and on a scientist to back me up here. Here are the well-known words of the Romantic Age artist, William Blake. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Here are the less well-known words of the nuclear age physicist, Richard Feynman. I too can see the stars on a desert night and feel them, and it does no harm to the mystery to know a little bit about it. For far more marvelous is the truth than any artist in the past imagined. What beautiful rhetoric about the mystery of the cosmos from an artist and from a scientist. I'll bring my own rhetoric to a close tonight by letting William Blake have the last word, a message that I think is as relevant to our revolutionary times as it is to Blake's. He said, "The arts and the sciences are the destruction of tyrannies and bad governments. Why should a good government endeavor to depress what is its chief and only support?" Thanks for your attention.